May I ask a quick question before you get
Sure,
started?
sure.
Will you be posting your PowerPoint slides on the CALT website?
They generally aren't because generally they're shared, and I believe I have a QR code at the end to share these.
Okay,
But
thank
if
you.
anyone wants them, I'm happy to share it. But generally, there's a lot going on, and I do all the video posting and the transcripts and all that. So adding the slides just adds a little bit more time. That it's just kind of, but
Yeah,
I'm
no
happy to
problem.
share
Yeah, no
any
problem. I'll
slide.
just get them through the presentation. Thank you.
I'm pretty sure if I don't, remind me at the end, and I'll share them. Um, Okay, so let's get started. So the focus of this is on strategies for closing equity gap. And there they are. Okay, so if you hold up your camera to the screen, to the QR code, it will give you a copy, and it will ask you, I believe, to make a copy in your Google account. So as long as you're logged in there, you'll have your own copy of these slides. You can also get it, if it's easier, by typing in tinyurl.com/close equity gaps using capital C, E, and G. I was pretty sure I had done that. I do that probably 95% of the time, but it's been one of those weeks. So, okay, is that working for everyone? Okay, so let's go on. And so when we talk about closing equity gaps, we should talk a little bit about which equity gaps, because there's all sorts of equity gaps out there. We used to call them achievement gaps. We tend to move away from it because, it's a lot of this is more due to opportunity gaps rather than differences in the ability of students. And we want to focus more on this is mostly the result of societal inequities in terms of the quality of education received and so forth. Race and ethnicity is a major factor. Gender is another factor, particularly in STEM fields. Household income is a major factor. First gen status tends to be one of the biggest factors that first gen students tend to struggle and end up with worse outcomes for pretty much all outcomes that we observe in terms of student success, GPAs, graduation probabilities, and so on. And this is from the 2020 census, where it looks at rates of graduation within 150% of program time. So this is for 4-year school. So this is basically the 6-year graduation rate from the time people start. And we notice that Asian students tend to be most successful, with about 77% of students getting a degree within 6 years, followed by non-residents, students from outside of the country, followed by white students, and then it just goes downhill from there. So we see a pretty dramatic difference. And if we look at the gap between Asian students and Black students, it's not quite twice as high for Asian students as it is for Black students, but it's a really dramatic difference. So that's just one of those equity gaps, and it's kind of easy to see the difference there. So one way of doing this, reducing equity gaps, is basically by creating a sense of community and belonging within classes. And there's a lot of evidence of that. And there's some simple things we can do. Some others are a bit more complicated. One of the simplest things we could do is to work on learning students. I say the simplest, but we all have trouble learning names, but learning names and using names is a really effective strategy for making connections with students. Michelle Miller, and I have a link in here to some resources. And one of the resources is a link to a podcast we did with Michelle Miller about a month or two ago, where she talks about a book she just wrote, a fairly short book, on strategies for learning names. And it's a good way of, and it's basically based on evidence in terms of what we know about how we can learn students' names or learn names more efficiently or more effectively. Arriving early to class and staying late. Don't just come in, start your class, and then disappear. Say hello to students, talk to them as they're coming in. while you're spending 10 or 15 minutes going through all the multi-factor authentication crap. You can chat with students a little bit to the extent that you can. And at the end of the class, talk to students on the way out, and check in with students, just be friendly with students. When students are working on activities, or even if you are doing some short lectures or whatever, wander around during that. Don't let the students in the back of the class hide back there. I know until I had a broken leg a couple of years ago, I used to put in about 3 or 4 miles when I was every day when I was teaching in Lanigan 101, and like 30 or 40 flights of steps, because when we're using a wireless microphone and we have remote controls for the remote presenter tool, we can be anywhere in the classroom. And don't let the students in the back hide back there. Get to know them a little bit, say hello when they're working in things, check in on them, and so forth. Another thing you can do, and this is fairly helpful, and this is one way where AI might be helpful, is do a survey at the beginning of your class. Find out what students are interested in, what their hobbies are, what their career aspirations are, what types of jobs do they want to get, what do they plan to go to grad school? If so, what are their plans for graduate school? And if you know more about your students, you can try to use examples that tie into those. And I mentioned that this is one way perhaps that AI could be used, is you could even have students fill out a survey using a Google form, for example, or Qualtrics, and find out more about these things. And then you could feed that into anonymously without including student names, but you could put in different identifiers for each student, and you could submit that to, say, ChatGPT or one of the other tools out there, and ask it to devise some examples that for a specific concept or applications that might connect to those students. And you could use it potentially even to create customized assignments. But at the very least, if you know more about your students, you can try to make more connections with your students. So that can be helpful. And also let students know explicitly how you're available. Should they contact you by email? Where is your office? A really good strategy is, instead of calling them office hours, calling them student hours, which by itself won't be enough to help get students there, but let them know that you'd like to see students, that you're there to help them. And sometimes people will meet students in the Lake Effect Cafe, or if the weather's nice, they might meet them out at a picnic table outside during the 2 weeks of summer we have here, or whatever, but or spring or whatever. But in any case, finding a place that's convenient for students, letting them know why you're there. Tony Jack wrote in a couple of his books about when he first went to college. His first book was The Privileged Poor, and his second book, it's in the references, I forgot the title, but in any case, what he noted is that when he first heard about office hours, he thought those were times when faculty were busy working in their office, and those were times when you shouldn't bother instructors. Because for most students coming out of high school, when you're called in to see someone in their office, it's usually not a very positive thing. So let them know why you have office hours or student hours, and let them know what it's for, and let them know how they could use them, and that you'd really like to get to know them more, and you'd really like to help support them, because they don't necessarily know that. The students who are most likely to come in under usual conditions are the students who are generally doing well otherwise, who are likely to be successful. The students who are struggling, first-gen students, are far less likely to come to your office without being directly invited or without being strongly encouraged to be there. So all that, by doing these things, and there's a lot of evidence of this, it can really help improve student success rates. Any other things, any suggestions that anyone has? Either unmute or just type something in the chat. Are there other ways of helping to build connections? You want to also do it among students.
I suggest sometimes corresponding with students by email over the semester, not just when they do well, but also if they're not doing so well, just let them know that, hey, if you need help with anything, we're available. We've got a tutoring service. I've got my office hours. I'll I'll be willing to do anything with whatever might be trouble, giving a little bit of problems in the class right now. Just be a little bit more open.
That makes a big difference. And there's actually been 2 studies done in the last 3 years in very large samples, randomized controlled experiments where students got their grades back. In one case, they got a very generic email from the professors that was pretty much the same for everyone in the control group, but in the treatment group, they got information where there was a growth mindset with the reminders of ways in which you were there, the instructor was there to support them, and that you care about their success. And what happened was the students who received that treatment letter where they were welcomed or encouraged to come by your office and so forth, ended up having substantial, in one study, which the one that was done further ago, it significantly reduced the equity gap for underrepresented Black male students in the class. That was in an economics class. In the other experiments in a biology class, it completely eliminated the equity gap in terms of student success, grades, and so forth for students in the treatment group who were first-gen students. So basically, it raised the performance of everyone who got the treatment. It raised their success. They had higher grades, and they were also, in the longer-term study, they were much more likely to graduate and to be there 4 years later, just as a result, by the way, of 2 emails after the first 2 graded assessments. One by itself, it turned out, wasn't enough, but the second one, it seemed to be dose sensitive. The second email with that factor has been really helpful. And have these tactics been in use at the university? They may have been used by individual faculty, but I don't think they've been done at a systematic level here. To be honest, I don't remember in those 2 studies, I don't remember which schools were part of the sample. The one in the introductory economics class was actually done at 3 different institutions, but they weren't identified. And they have been significant. In those cases, at least, they have been successful in reducing it. So everything I'm going to talk about, at least in terms of broad strategy, has been documented typically in randomized controlled trials to be effective in reducing these equity gaps. Other questions or comments or strategies that might be helpful? Okay, so we're going to be focusing on things that have been shown to reduce some of those gaps so that we don't see as much of a difference. Okay, and yeah, is it Jeannie Brown? Invite students who represent diverse backgrounds to visit class to tell the stories of adjustment and struggle and how they overcame them. That's really helpful. That type of growth mindset messages, normalizing struggle as part of the educational experience in general, or as part of life, is really, really helpful. Because again, if you don't feel you're likely to be successful because very few people in your peer groups and your high school class and other things have gone on and been successful in college, it really is easy to settle into mindset that you're not going to be successful either. But when they see students who are like them, when they hear those types of stories, it can make a big difference. It's basically building a growth mindset that you can get better by practice. And when they see that other people have been successful, particularly if it's people who share similar characteristics, it can make a big difference. And again, there's a lot of evidence on that. And it would be really helpful to implement strategies within the university and then track the data. And yes, it would. The problem is we do have academic freedom, and it's kind of hard to get all instructors to buy in. And it's also sometimes hard to get things through IRB. That's another story. But in any case, that's never mind. Let me not say more about that. But yes, it is really helpful when these types of things are done. And we were talking with someone in the podcast, actually the author of the book we're using this spring, one of the books, the 10 to 25 is about student motivation. David Yeager, he's done some really incredible work. He did an experiment involving all of the freshmen at the University of Texas at Austin in a randomized controlled trial where they got different welcome messages, where some of them received a generic welcome message welcoming them to the institution, whatever the mascot was, and the long history of it. And the others received a message that had some growth mindset messaging, and it's resulted in significant differences in student retention rates and student success rates. And again, it reduced or eliminated many of these equity gaps. So in the reading group, we'll be talking about some of these studies in more detail. That was something I didn't get to the resource. Well, we'll see. We'll talk about some of the resources I did provide. But yes, doing controlled experiments or doing studies of these things would be really helpful. And fortunately, many schools are doing this. And there's many researchers doing this, increasingly with large samples at multiple institutions. So we are getting better data because, you know, much of the history of faculty development and educational research was based on small studies, small samples that were not always very well designed or controlled, but it's getting better, that the quality of the research being done has improved drastically in the last 20 to 30 years. But yeah, all of these things have been shown to be helpful in at least some studies. I qualify it that way. Okay. So these were the two studies I mentioned. The chemistry class was the first 2 graded assignments. It improved all grades, but it especially benefited the first gen students. It was a study done by Elizabeth Canning, Makita White, and Bill Davis. I think I was at Washington University. I forgot where it was. In any case, though, just those 2 individualized growth mindset messages led to significant improvements in grades. The other study, which was called My Professor Cares, it had a really catchy title, so it got mentioned in all the newspapers and, you know, and other talk shows and so forth. And we did interview the authors of both of these, by the way. But in these large economics classes in multiple institutions, 2 personalized messages again, indicating that the instructor is available to help, reduces the racial equity gap in grades, and it increased persistent rates for male students that was still true 4 years after that initial intervention in just 1 class. And the effect size is remarkably large for essentially 2 emails to students as after their first 2 graded assignments. It's really remarkable. And those studies were done independently. Neither was aware of the research being done by the others. So they were actually pleased to hear that other studies had found remarkably similar results. Now, so that's how we can improve our relationships as students and our connections. But, you know, there's that whole theme that showed up in the book, Relationship Rich Education, that building a community, building relationships among the students is really essential. If you think back to your college experience, you probably remember a lot of the interactions you had with other students. And the more we can help students connect to each other, the more likely it is that they're going to persist and be successful. And even though there's a lot of negative political comments and social attitudes towards higher ed right now, the rate of return to a degree in college is still the highest we've ever seen that we've ever measured historically. So the rate of return to education is still remarkably high. And if we have a lot of students coming here accumulating a lot of debt and then leaving without a degree, they're worse off than if they hadn't come here often. But if they come here and they're successful, it can make a huge difference in their lives, in their future careers and so forth. So, you know, building these connections and helping students get connected to each other as well as to their instructors makes a remarkable difference. Using cooperative or team-based learning activities can be helpful. And actually, we had a presentation done by Kristen Croyle, the Dean of Arts and Sciences. I think it was 2 days ago. Well, sometime this week. It's all kind of a blur, but we do have a recording of that where she talked about cooperative learning activities. And one of the things she suggested, and I've also been suggesting this for years too, is that when you put students in teams, don't let them select their own teams, because they're going to connect to their friends if they have friends, and the students who don't have friends are not going to be as connected to others. And also there's some strengths from diversity. Students can learn more when they're working with people who are not like them. They can learn from their experiences. And also, if some of the students are working with friends, they're going to be talking about going out to parties or plans they're making for the weekend or other things. If they're just put in a group that they're working on for specific tasks in your class, they're much more likely to focus on the tasks you want them to work on. And so there's a lot of, again, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that either randomly putting students in group or using some type of stratification. For example, for many years now, I've had students in my capstone course work on these group projects where they've been working on either a book project as a class project, or they've been working on podcast projects. And the way I've sorted them into groups is by asking them how many math and statistics courses they've had in the past, because much of either they're going to be doing econometric studies quite often, or they're going to be reading a lot of papers with quite a bit of math and statistics and econometrics and so forth in it. And it really helps to make sure that we distribute the students around so that everyone has some students who have a stronger background in those areas, so that the groups are fairly balanced in terms of their ability to analyze articles and understand things and to conduct their own research. And it's worked really well. And I do that in a transparent way. I have them fill out a very simple form asking them their name and the question, and that question. I sort them from highest to lowest. And if there's 8 groups in the class, I just go down from 1 through 8 over and over again repeatedly, then resort it by the numbers, and those become the groups. And that's worked pretty well. There are some studies, though, that have found that when in female minority groups, females tend not to be as involved in discussions. And that when they're female majority groups, females do tend to be more actively engaged in discussion. That there does tend to be some degree of male domination in small groups. There was an interesting study done a few years ago by that Olga, I forgot her last name. I have a link to the study in any case, and to a podcast we did with the author of that, another economist, where they had teams set up for a whole year in an MBA program, and they found that that again, it was better to have some groups that were female majority and essentially no groups where there were female minority groups, because it ended up resulting in more equitable participation and higher quality outputs. So you may want to do some other stratification. It doesn't have to be entirely transparent. Another thing that can really be helpful is to let students have a little bit more say about how they express their learning. And if students are able to bring in their experiences, some students might be really good at creating videos. Others might be really good at organizing things. Others might be relatively good at writing. Others might be able to do more creative might have a stronger background in creative activities in some way. And if we give students multiple ways of expressing their learning, perhaps using an unpaper or something like that, where students can demonstrate their learning with anything other than a standard paper. There's a lot of ways of doing that, but allowing students to express their learning in ways that tie into their own experiences can often be helpful in coming up with some interesting group experiences and building more student-to-student connections. Peer instruction activities have been found in numerous studies to be really effective. There was a classic study done about 14 or 15 years ago, which is when I first started using undergraduate TAs in my large class after seeing the results of conference where there was presentation, where it was in a large biology class at a university where I forgot which one, it might have been University of Georgia, but in any case, where they had graduate TAs and undergraduate TAs in an undergraduate intro bio class. And what happened was everyone in the class, the students and the TAs, took an initial test of understanding in biology, and they took it again at the end. And what they found was that the students who worked in groups that had undergraduate TAs learned more than students who worked in groups that had graduate TAs. And furthermore, the largest learning gains came for the undergraduate TAs themselves, so that the undergraduate TAs learn more by explaining things to other students, and students again learn more when they had other undergraduate students who were only a little beyond them in terms of their understanding, assisting them in their learning. And so that process of peer interaction can be really helpful. Eric Mazur, in a number of studies, as well as some studies done by what's his name? Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. Whose name is, I'm slipping at this moment. But in any case, there have been a lot of studies that have found when you combine peer instruction in class, when you include some peer instruction in a class, students end up learning more than if you just rely on instructor presentations and workbooks and assignments and other things. That when students explain things to each other, it reinforces that knowledge much more deeply, partly because the students who already have a somewhat better understanding of it reinforce that learning by having to explain it to someone who doesn't quite get it. It forces them to explain it more carefully. It reveals things they don't quite understand, helps them address those gaps in their understanding. And the students who are hearing it from students who've just recently learned it tend to be better connected to it than if a faculty member or a grad student explains it. Because again, it's sometimes hard for us to see what students don't understand because it makes a lot of sense for us. Novices have different areas of the brain activated when they're faced with problems than experts do. You know, when we see a problem, we can pretty easily identify what type of model applies, how it fits, and how to apply it. Students have to struggle with that. It requires much more cognitive processing. And again, it's easier for other students to recognize that and to help them overcome that. So bringing in peer instruction in every study that I've seen where it's been tested has resulted in some significant improvements for all students. And again, it especially tends to improve the benefits of those students who tend to be left behind. Encouraging students to get to know each other, it could be through perhaps some it could be from an icebreaker activity at the beginning of class, or it could be as part of the team-based learning or cooperative learning activities. But helping them get to know each other is really important. One of the first things I do in the large class, where I have typically 250 to 400 students, is I ask the students to get to say hello to the students around them, to state where they're from, what they're interested in, just spend a couple of minutes chatting with each other, getting to know their names and their interests and why they're there, what their major is, and so forth. Because, as I said, the students tend to sit in the same seat every day in those large classes. And the students around them are going to be the ones they're going to work with. And just getting them to get to know each other that first day makes it much more likely they'll work productively with them when I ask them to do think pair shares or working on small group activities and so forth. So those connections can really make a difference. And oops, and somehow the slides went away. Let me see if I can find where they went. Here we go. Okay, so those connections are important. Use inclusive discussion strategies. If you're doing a smaller class where you have a lot of discussions, not everyone feels that comfortable discussing things with each other, discussing things in public, especially in a moderately large class. Are there any strategies you've used to help make everyone feel comfortable, especially those students who might be a little bit more of an introvert?
I've held projects and assignments where students had to do some kind of statistical study on something that they felt a little that they felt personal about, that interested them personally. But before they actually got to the strategy, before they got to the project, they'd be discussing these topics or explaining to some of their peers in the classroom why it was important to them or what they wanted to do and how they intended to do it, just to get them a sense of being more open and being able to talk about something they feel like they know something a little bit about already, and so they'd be more likely to open up and be inclusive with others, and others could maybe join in or see exactly what they could bring to it or what they could suggest about how to go about or what to maybe look into.
Right. Opening the discussions to things that students are more comfortable talking about that they connect to personally lowers that barrier. It reduces the risk of making a mistake with something they say because they're talking about their own reactions, their own feelings. That's a good strategy. Some students just are afraid of being wrong about something or not, just not comfortable sharing their opinions because they're afraid it'll be rejected by the group. A good way of doing it is combining it with a think, pair, share type activity. And I see Jeannie had just put that in. So yeah, doing a think, pair, share can be helpful because then they're sharing the results of the combined discussion rather than just their own thoughts. And that takes some of the pressure off, that it's not their own views that are at stake. It's now something that's a shared result of their work. So it makes it a little less personal, so that they're not putting themselves at risk in the same way. What about those people who always won't stop talking and the people who are really reluctant to join in? Any strategies there?
I'm going to chime in there and
Sure.
um, thinking about like the involvement and stuff like that. It doesn't always have to be, I think, in order to gauge something that where they're speaking out for their class. Because I've seen more and more students that are hesitant to do that. My classes are more very personal and stuff too. So I provide opportunities to do some writing. So when they're leaving, the exit ticket opportunity to reflect on something about class that day. And then I reply to that because I find that there might be questions and things that they didn't feel comfortable saying out loud in class. And so the more they get feedback there, I found that the more that they'll start to engage as we get to know each other that way in the class with their peers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they're much more comfortable writing something that only you see than revealing something to the whole class. That seems very personal. Polling can also, in larger classes, polling can also do that. And it can be anonymous if you just want to get that feeling. But yeah, having students write about it or giving them the alternative of writing. You could also use discussion boards, because in some ways, discussion boards are much more inclusive, because some people don't want to just blurt out the first thing that, but with a discussion board, you have that delete key. If you don't like the way you phrase something, you can go back and change it until you click submit. So, you could use written discussions, have individual submissions, individual writing assignments that are turned in. It could be just, a 1-minute quiz at the end or an exit ticket. Those are great ways of getting students more involved, because if they're not that comfortable speaking, giving them other ways of expressing themselves can be really useful. You could also use a random name generator and have it randomly call on people, but that tends to result in a little anxiety at first, but it tends to dampen down once they see that everyone's doing it, and that they're not going to be picked on for being wrong about something. That as long as you normalize that's part of learning. As we said before, making mistakes is part of learning, and that's just how learning occurs. So trying to find ways where everyone can be heard and everyone's comfortable getting their views across, and it's not dominated by a small number of people, are basic. There's a lot of good strategies out there, and these were all great. Okay, moving on. Small groups can help. That if you're talking to 2 or 3 people, everyone is going to say a lot more than if they're one of 30 or 40 or 50 or 200 or 300 students in the class. Small groups is really useful. Rotating who reports, records, etc. for the group can also be really helpful, whether the permanent groups or even just ad hoc groups. And again, we do have a recording of Dean Croyle's talk on this, and that's really helpful. There's a lot more detail on there, but try to keep everyone's participation balanced to the extent possible to give every student a voice. When you use examples, try to use inclusive examples. You may not want to be talking about the examples of people off on yachts or people buying up large countries or companies or other things or whatever. Use examples that may relate to, or use a diverse set of examples and so forth. And try to avoid practices that generate a stereotype threat. I remember years ago when one of the first things I heard about when I was in this position was an equity walk that someone was doing in their classes. And has anyone heard of equity walks? I think they pretty much died off. Well, the way they were set up, and it was seen to be a good idea at the time by people who practice them, was to have all your students line up along a line and then ask everyone to step forward if one of the parents had a college degree, or to step forward if their parents had gone to college, or to step forward if they lived in a suburb or whatever, or etc. And basically what it was doing is it was making explicit some of the differences in opportunity. The goal was to show that our students come in with really unequal opportunities. But one of the problems with that, oops, I didn't put in that. One of the problems, well, yeah, it's kind of there. One of the problems with that is it generates stereotype threat. It's saying, look, these are students who come in with more advantages. They tend to be more successful. If you don't fit into that, if you're being left behind, maybe you don't belong there in the same way. And that's been generally seen to be damaging. There's been a little bit of research on that, but in general, there's a pretty much consensus that you don't want to be singling students out in ways that might identify, that may make them identify as someone who's not going to be successful. You want to make and create an environment where everyone is seen and is identified as being capable of being successful. And the equity walks can break down pretty easily. Decolonizing your curriculum, providing as many diverse examples as you can in your readings and so forth. And virtually all disciplines have some researchers and some people out there working on coming up with ways of groups of writings and writers and readings and so forth that are more diverse, that appeals to a wider variety of cultures, a wider variety of backgrounds and so forth. And search for decolonize and then your discipline, and you're very likely to find some resources out there, because there's probably some people out there working on coming up with a group of or list of writers or readings or other things can be used to provide a more diverse background than many of the traditional textbooks tend to provide. So come up with as many examples as you can. But if you can't do that, or even if you do that, but a really good example, a really good practice in general, is to go back and have students connect their own lived experience with, or to come up with examples that come from their own lived experience or their future career plans. When we talk about examples in behavioral economics, for example, I'll say, have you ever seen this happen? What would be an example where you've seen this occurring? Or how might this be useful in future classes or in your expected future careers? And if you know the careers that the students are aiming for, you could use those specific examples. But letting students make connections between what they're learning and their own life can be really helpful. And again, encouraging and making students feel more connected. There's a growth mindset. A lot of work's been done by Carol Dweck and many others on growth mindsets. And basically, again, I've got a lot of stuff here, so I'm going to go a little bit more quickly. Growth mindset is a belief that you can improve your capabilities by working at it. That you always start off making mistakes as you learn, but the more you practice, the more you develop your skills, the better you become. A fixed mindset is one where people believe they're either good at something or they're not. And we all have growth mindsets with some things. We all tend to have it with other. We tend to have fixed mindsets with others. Math is one of those areas where a lot of people have a fixed mindset. I'm either good at math or I'm not good at math. We also see the same thing about art. I'm either really creative and good at artwork, or really creative, or I'm just not a very creative person, etc. And what we really like students to develop, in general, at least with our coursework, is the ability to, or a belief that they are capable of being successful if they work at it. And we have to help encourage that. And giving them examples of people who struggled and then became successful can be really helpful. And that relates to that earlier point about perhaps having former students come in and talk about ways in which they were successful, or other scholars in the discipline come in and talk about how they may have struggled and been successful. And, or telling some stories from your past about how you may have initially faced some barriers, but eventually you were able to overcome them, even though they were difficult at the time. And helping students develop that. And there's a lot of strategies that can be used. has been shown to be somewhat effective. And normalize that learning from mistakes, as was noted before. A phrase that's been used for that is to fail forward, that learn from the mistakes, grow from it. And there's even some research suggesting that when you get things wrong with, say, initial polling questions, with polling in classes, that you're more likely to remember the things that you got wrong initially, but recognize they were wrong and reframe the problem, than if you happen to get it right the first time, because there's a little bit of stress or anxiety connected with getting it wrong that tends to reinforce learning. And that we make mistakes, but we move on. And again, relevant disclosure about past academic struggles may be helpful. Using low stakes or no stakes assessments to the extent possible can be really helpful, so that students don't have a large penalty from trying something. Ideally, they'd always be able to practice things before they're ever graded on the task, or at least if they're very low stakes. So if there's a mistake they make or they don't do well initially, they're not going to be blocked from being successful in the course because of one bad quiz grade or even a few initial quiz grades. Because ultimately, we're concerned with how much students learn by the end of the class, not how much they learn, how much they knew coming into the class. Our goal of focus should be more on the output than the input. And giving students as many opportunities as possible, as feasible for revision, is really helpful. Certainly helps encourage the growth mindset. Angela Bauer, who is the chair of the chemistry department, I believe it might be biology, but I think it's chemistry, at Green Bay. She was a faculty member there, and then she moved to High Point, and she's introduced growth mindset messaging, and it was chemistry. And what she included for everyone she created a slide that had a growth mindset message. One of those stories about someone who struggled and then worked their way past it. And in chemistry, there's lots of examples where people struggled initially until eventually they made a breakthrough and were then successful. Every week there was a slide that was shared with all the instructors that they introduced in their classes at the start of one of their classes every week, and it ended up reducing or eliminating I believe it completely eliminated the opportunity gap or the equity gap for first gen students, and it significantly reduced many of the others. So that growth mindset messaging can be really important. And I already mentioned that study by Elizabeth Canning and Makita White and their co-author. In any case, Canning, White, and Davis found that growth mindset messaging was really effective, especially when it was repeated after an assignment, after a grade, because that's a really good, telling students this stuff before they're graded doesn't have the same effect as after they've got that initial assessment that they struggled with. That sort of message can be especially effective right then. There's also another study done by Elizabeth Canning and others. This was done at Harvard, actually, I believe, where they found that faculty mindset is really important. That if faculty believe in a fixed mindset, compared to they gave them a growth mindset inventory where they were asked a series of questions. The faculty members who had a fixed mindset had students that on average performed less well than the faculty who had a growth mindset. So if you believe that your students aren't going to be successful, many of your students aren't going to be successful, it turns out you're right. On the other hand, if you believe that most of your students will be successful, you also tend to be right. And in particular, though, faculty who had a growth mindset not only had students that were more successful at higher retention rates and so forth, they also had much lower equity gaps on all those dimensions. And a number of studies have shown that. So, it really helps for us to believe that our students can be successful too, because if we don't, they pick up on that message, and it tends to be particularly harmful for those who are already most at risk. Now, one thing I always have to mention is that we do know a lot about how people learn. And the three things that have been shown to be effective in every study I've seen, going back in the case of retrieval practice to about a century and a half now, is that the more we practice retrieving information that we've encoded, the better we are at remembering it long term. And this is very different from how students tend to study. Students tend to read things over and over again. That is remarkably ineffective, except in terms of your ability to recall things in the short term. That helps your ability to take a test in a few hours or maybe the next morning, but your ability to remember things a week later is pretty much not affected by a lot of repeated attempts to read something or to store something. The more we have students practice retrieving, yes, James Lang's small teaching is very good on all these things, and he has a lot of really simple techniques you can use to build these into classes in generally 5 to 15-minute activities. But the more we can get students to use retrieval practice, the more they'll learn and the more they'll remember. Space practice is, instead of cramming, if students spend a little bit of time studying every few days or every week, if they space their practice over longer periods of time, they tend to remember things more deeply. And interleave practice is when they tend to mix things together and they have to determine which model is appropriate. And that's generally not how, well, in general, many of our courses are set up where students have a small number of high stakes exams, which tends to just encourage block practice, where it tends to encourage students to cram. It tends to encourage them to study a lot right before it and not really engage in this long-term practice, not spacing out the retrieval practice. And interleave practice is generally how most courses and most textbooks are set up, where students learn something, they're given some problems on it, and then they move on to another topic and leave the earlier topics behind. That's block practice. And that is not nearly as effective as interleave practice, where students have to determine which type of model is most appropriate. It requires a little bit more cognitive effort, and it results in more long-term recall. Small Teaching is a very good book on this. Also, Make It Stick is another good book on this. And there's Michelle Miller has Minds Online, another book that covers all of these topics really nicely. But all these things are important. And to the extent to which we can design our courses to encourage students to practice retrieving information and applying it, the more we can space out their efforts so that they're not just doing things, studying for 3 or 4 exams the night before those exams, the more they have to do a little bit of work regularly throughout the term, the more likely it is they'll remember it. And a simple way of building in some interleave practice is, if you have weekly exams, include perhaps progressively cumulative exams where students have to go back, and this builds in both space practice and some interleave practice, where they have to go back and do some problems they worked on before. Students don't like that because it's a bit harder, but it also results in more long-term recall. So to the extent to which we can design this into our courses, it benefits all students, but again, it especially benefits the students who tend to be left behind. So some of this can be automated, and particularly in STEM disciplines, with adaptive learning platforms, personalized learning systems such as those provided through Lumen Learning, and all that's free for SUNY. Or you can use mastery learning type systems where you build your own, or you set it up in Brightspace, or you use one of the publishers provided things where students get to have lots of time practicing their work and practicing it. You get better at things by practicing it and giving students some examples of this, asking them how they learned to play a sport, how they learned, how good they were when they first tried riding a bicycle and so forth, or how they became better at if they play music, how they became better by repeatedly practicing and so forth. Reminding them that, we're acquiring skills in our classes and it takes practice. Another issue in terms of equity, and the college has done a fair amount to address this, at least is attempting to address this, that when students are faced with concerns about where the next meal is coming from, how they're going to pay their bills and so forth, it can cause some significant issues. That when students are stressed and worrying about their family situation, financial worries, where their next meal is coming from, how they'll be able to pay for various things, that hurts. And another thing that can really be harmful is if students hold off purchasing books. which is a really good reason for using either OER materials that are free and available on the first day of course, or some of the SUNY personalized or adaptive learning platforms that are also free and available on the first day of class, rather than more expensive publisher-provided materials, unless they're done through inclusive access. So it's added to the student bills and it comes out of financial aid, rather than something that students have to pay, because the students who are most likely to postpone buying a textbook or other materials are the students who are already often more at risk because they face other scarcity issues. So the scarcity mindset can have a really significant impact on students' ability to be successful. The more students are worried about other things, the harder it is to concentrate on learning. Yeah, I mentioned this. And, we do provide a fair amount of support here, at least while students are on campus, with resources on services for mental health, food insecurity, and other support. But it doesn't hurt to mention all those support resources in the syllabus or in Brightspace, just to remind students that we do have some support resources here for that. And I'm going to go over a number of things really quickly here. Structure is really important. Scaffolding assignments, making sure students are getting feedback at every stage. Instead of giving students a 30-page paper or a 20-page paper and just saying, here, write this paper on this range of topics from this general area, have them submit a proposal, have them submit a bibliography, have them do an annotated bibliography, have them do an outline, and give them some feedback at each stage of that. That can be really helpful. And some of this was talked about in the last session on transparency and learning and teaching, or the TILT approach. But make clear your expectations and give students support along the way so that they don't go off in an unproductive direction early in a way that's going to make it difficult for them to recover. If students turn in a bibliography that's made up entirely of websites that are not very reliable, or from Fox News or from MSNBC or from other websites that may not involve a lot of peer-reviewed research, you can redirect them at an early stage before it has an impact on the quality of their study. Or if they're trying to do some type of a statistical analysis and they're going in a direction where they just don't have statistics available, or where they don't have access to the techniques that they need to be able to do that, that's less of an issue now than it used to be. But you can always help guide or shift students' direction early before they end up devoting a lot of time in a direction that may not be as successful for them. So giving them more structure, more feedback, and more guidance so that they can focus their efforts on learning rather than trying to guess what they need to know is helpful. Every study that I've seen involving active learning suggests that active learning increases learning for all students, but in general, virtually all studies find the gains are largest for first-gen students, Pell-eligible students, and students from historically minoritized groups. Every study I've seen on this, and there have been a lot of them. Cornell did a massive study on this, and in fact, they found that when active learning was introduced, pretty much all of those gaps were cut by at least 50%, and some were entirely eliminated. In particular, they ended up finding that the only residual gaps they found were for first-gen and Pell-eligible students. The historically minoritized effect, now that's Cornell's population, which is a little bit different than ours, but those completely disappeared when they provided active learning techniques. And the effects of being first-gen or Pell-eligible was cut by generally about half or more in most disciplines. So active learning helps. Students tend to be resistant to active learning because students generally find it much more comfortable to sit in a classroom, to listen, and to have everything handed to them in terms of well-organized lectures, which they generally tend not to recall very much afterwards. The more students work with materials, it tends not to. The more they interact with the discipline and the materials in the class, the more challenging it is, but also the more learning occurs. But remind them of that. You have to help convince students that active learning classes really increase their learning, even if it may not feel as good when they make mistakes, but that's part of that process of growth. They're not going to get the same growth sitting there listening to you lecture at them. although they may perceive that. There was a study done about 4 or 5 years ago, again at Harvard, where they found that students were asked to, in sections where some sections were using active learning, others were not, students felt that the instructors who were not using active learning were more effective, yet the learning gains were larger in those classes where active learning techniques were used, even though the students felt they had not learned as much as the students in the classes where they were lectured at. So it is important to sell that this is important in helping student success. Very quickly, autonomy, supportive instruction, and UDL can be helpful in supporting learning. There's, again, a fair amount of suggestion of this, giving students more of a voice in the class, helping them, letting them work and formulate parts of the syllabus, maybe even selecting some of the topics for the course, as long as they tie into the learning goals that the course needs to arrive at, can be really helpful. Similarly, talking to students about AI policies. It should be of course AI and discussion policies. Providing students with multiple ways of demonstrating their learning can be effective. And all those things tend to increase intrinsic motivation, increasing engagement, reducing equity gaps, and there's a growing number of studies that suggest that. Now, this is a set of resources that does provide at least some of the evidence for all of these things. Here, the first set talk about some of the evidence on equity gaps out there. There was a podcast dealing with that, an interesting study done at, well, an interesting project down in at the University of Central Florida in reducing equity gaps in K through 12, actually. Some studies of or resources on the building community are here, some podcasts on it. These were all taken from podcasts we've done, but mostly with the people who did the original research. Some other studies on the impacts of communication. These studies are available. They're all out there on the web. Some other podcasts, some strategies for inclusive representation, some background on that, some growth mindset studies, some podcasts, and in general, some studies of with Jim Lang and with Michelle Miller and all these other people about evidence-based teaching methods. So there's a lot of really good resources there, and we've really just skimmed the surface of a lot of it. Anyone have any other suggestions for reducing equity gaps that you've tried that's been successful? Sorry, I've talked so much. I tried not to, but well, I intended not to. Let me say that. Any other suggestions or thoughts or questions? Okay, and if anyone has any questions or wants some follow-ups or some other resources on any of these, I'm happy to send you some, because there's a lot of good research going on and a lot of people are doing a lot, dealing with those very same issues we're facing, everyone is, and as a result, there's a lot of people studying these. Okay, well, I'll stop the session, I'll stop the recording, and thank you all for being